Imagine losing someone you love. Now imagine that instead of burying them and walking away, you kept their bones nearby, in your home. For years, you painted them. You carried them when your group moved. You touched them. This isn't a horror story. For most of human history, this was normal. Archaeologists have a term for it. Secondary burial. It sounds clinical. It is anything but. And once you understand what it actually meant, you'll never think about death, or grief, or memory, or what a goodbye is supposed to look like the same way again. Part 1. The two-stage death. Here's how it worked. When someone died in many ancient communities, the body wasn't simply put in the ground and left there. Death, it turns out, didn't happen once. It happened in stages. First, the body was dealt with, sometimes buried temporarily, sometimes left exposed to the elements to decompose naturally. And sometimes, this is the part that tends to stop people, deliberately defleshed by hand using stone tools. Researchers call this excarnation, the intentional removal of soft tissue from bone. It sounds brutal to modern ears, but the archaeological evidence suggests it wasn't violence. It was care, a slow, deliberate process of separating a person from their body so that what remained could be preserved. Because here's the second stage, the part almost nobody knows about. Once only the bones remained, they weren't discarded. They were dug back up, cleaned, sometimes painted with red ochre, a pigment ancient humans used across nearly every continent for ritual purposes. Sometimes wrapped, and then carried. Back into the camp, back into daily life, sometimes for years, before any final burial ever took place. This wasn't an accident of ancient carelessness. This was a choice, a ritual, a relationship that continued long after the heart stopped. Part 2. Meat is yours, bone is mine. To understand why, you have to understand how ancient people actually thought about bodies. One researcher studying these practices in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, found an old saying still used in the region today, a phrase that seems to echo something much older. The meat is yours, the bone is mine. Flesh was temporary, it rotted, it fed insects, it disappeared. Bone was permanent. Bone held the lineage, bone held the life. So when the flesh was gone, what remained wasn't waste. It wasn't a discard, it was the person, distilled down to what actually mattered, stripped of everything that decayed, leaving only what didn't. And that person, reduced to bone, didn't leave. They stayed. Part 3. The skulls of Jericho. Nowhere is this clearer than in one of the most unsettling and remarkable archaeological finds of the 20th century. The plastered skulls of Jericho. Around 9,000 years ago, in what is now the West Bank, a Neolithic community did something extraordinary. When someone died, they would sometimes remove the skull from the rest of the skeleton, then they modeled the face back onto it. Using plaster, they reconstructed the nose, the cheeks, the lips. They inset shells into the eye sockets to recreate a gaze. They rebuilt the face of the dead, by hand, with plaster and shell, and then they kept it, in the home, sometimes displayed, sometimes buried beneath the floor the family walked on every single day, only to be dug up again later. Think about that for a moment. You would have walked across the resting place of your grandmother, your father, your child, every day, for years, because that's simply where they were. Not gone, present, underfoot, part of the architecture of daily life. This wasn't unique to Jericho. Similar practices, skull removal, skull curation, plastering, painting, appear across multiple sites in the ancient Near East during the same period, suggesting this wasn't an isolated ritual, but a widespread way of relating to the dead. Part 4. A village built on its own dead. At Çatalhöyük, one of the largest and best preserved Neolithic settlements ever excavated, archaeologists found something equally striking. People were buried directly beneath the floors of the houses they had lived in, not in a separate cemetery, not outside the settlement. Underneath the exact rooms where daily life continued to happen. Cooking, sleeping, raising children, directly above the bones of family members who had died. And in some cases, these burials were reopened. Bodies were retrieved, skulls were removed, sometimes replastered, sometimes repainted, and then either returned to the same location or moved elsewhere in the settlement. The house itself became a kind of living memorial, generation after generation, built quite literally on top of the people who came before. Part 5. The bones that kept moving. This pattern, retrieval, handling, repositioning, shows up again and again across very different cultures and time periods, which is part of what makes it so significant. This wasn't one strange group doing one strange thing. This was a pattern. In Bronze Age tombs on the island of Crete, archaeologists have found something that looks less like a single burial event and more like an ongoing relationship between the living and the dead. Bones weren't placed once and left undisturbed. They were moved, rearranged, pushed aside to make room for the next person who died, piled together, sorted, handled again and again, sometimes across many generations. Think about what that actually means. A tomb wasn't a sealed door you walked through once, said goodbye, and never opened again. It was something closer to a room the living kept returning to, a place you visited, a place you rearranged with your own hands, a place where the dead weren't gone. Exactly. They were relocated, reorganized, kept in active circulation among the living, tomb after tomb, generation after generation. Death, in other words, wasn't an ending. It was a change in address. Part 6. Older than our species. Now, here's where the story gets even stranger, because the evidence for this behavior stretches back much further than most people would guess. Isolated human bones, deliberately colored, have been found from roughly 30,000 years ago in Central Europe, long before writing, long before agriculture, long before anything we'd recognize as civilization. This was during the Upper Paleolithic, the depths of the last ice age, and some researchers believe this instinct might be older still, possibly older than our own species. There's a theory, and it remains just a theory, that this behavior echoes something observed in our closest living relatives. Chimpanzee mothers who lose an infant have been documented carrying the body for days, sometimes for weeks, grooming it, refusing to set it down even as the body visibly changes. If that connection holds, then keeping the dead close isn't simply a cultural invention passed down through human tradition. It might be something even deeper than culture, something closer to instinct. An ancient, pre-human refusal to accept that connection simply ends when breathing stops. Part 7. Bones you could wear. And it wasn't only skulls that were kept. In numerous cultures across history and across continents, bones, and sometimes teeth, from the dead were worn on the body itself. As pendants, as parts of necklaces, carried physically against the skin by the people who had loved them. This wasn't decoration in the way we think of jewelry today. Ancient people believed something of the person's essence. Their strength, their protection, their presence remained inside the bone itself. Not as a metaphor, not as a comforting story people told themselves. As a literal, physical fact understood the same way you might understand that fire's hot or water's wet. The dead protected the living, directly, physically, from around the neck. Part 8. Why we stopped. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If this was normal for tens of thousands of years, if staying physically close to the dead, handling their bones, living above them, carrying them, wearing them, was simply what humans did across nearly every corner of the ancient world, then what changed? Why did we stop? Some anthropologists point to something surprisingly mundane: permanent settlement. For most of human history, groups moved. They followed food, followed seasons, followed herds. And when you move constantly, the dead move with you, because leaving them behind means leaving them behind forever, unvisited, unreachable. But once humans began settling permanently, building fixed villages, then towns, then cities, something shifted. The dead no longer needed to be carried. They could simply stay where they were buried, because the living weren't going anywhere either. The tomb became fixed in place, and once it was fixed, visiting it slowly became optional rather than necessary. And across thousands of years, optional slowly became rare. Part 9. This still exists today. Here's the part that might surprise you most. This isn't purely ancient history. In parts of the world today, this relationship with the dead has never actually stopped. In the highlands of Sulawesi, in Indonesia, the Torajan people practice something called majanini, sometimes called the ritual of the walking dead. Every few years, families exhume the preserved bodies of deceased relatives, clean them, dress them in fresh clothing, and walk them physically through the village. To outsiders, this can look shocking, even disturbing, but to the Torajan people, it is an act of love, a continuation of relationship, a refusal to let death sever a bond that mattered. It is, in other words, almost exactly what humans were doing 30,000 years ago. The behavior never disappeared, it simply became rare, practiced by fewer and fewer cultures, as the modern world increasingly push death behind closed doors. Part 10. The anomaly is us, which brings us to the real point of all of this. In the modern world, most of us bury someone once. We attend a funeral, we visit a grave, if we visit at all. And a hard line gets drawn. A funeral, a burial, and then distance. Death becomes something handled by professionals, sealed behind a coffin lid, tucked behind a cemetery gate, rarely spoken of directly again. But for nearly the entire span of human history, that line simply didn't exist. The dead stayed involved. They were carried when the group moved. They were present during rituals. Their bones were cleaned by loving hands, worn against the skin, buried beneath the floors people walked on every day. So when you feel that instinct, the desire to keep a photo close, to revisit a memory, to talk to someone who's gone as though they might still hear you, you're not imagining a new, strange impulse. You're echoing something that ran uninterrupted through nearly the entire length of human existence, and only recently, in the smallest sliver of our history, went quiet. The distance we now feel from death, the discomfort, the desire to keep it at arm's length, isn't ancient at all. It's new. It's the anomaly. For nearly all of human history, the normal thing to do was the opposite of what we do now. You didn't let go. You kept them close. You cleaned their bones with your own hands. You carried them with you into whatever came next. Because as far as your ancestors were concerned, the people you loved didn't disappear the moment their heart stopped. They just changed form, and you weren't ready to say goodbye yet.